Now, for any path of spirituality to be truly mature, is required that it has serious contemplation about death. Death, the ultimate reality, the ultimate fact. Yet, how many paths have contemplated death in a mature manner? You see, this is a commonality between Tantra, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Zen Buddhism of Japan. Each are, in a way, centered around a very transformative consciousness of death. Tantra, in fact, in many ways can be summed up as a psycho-spiritual path. A psycho-spiritual path that utilizes the contemplation of death as the stepping stone to samadhi, to moksha, to freedom, to spiritual liberation. And this is true not only for Hindu Tantra, Buddhist Tantra also. It is the very path of contemplating the facticity of death and through that attaining to an organically unified understanding of the entire circle of life. The Bhagavad Gita, of course, is eventually delivered on the battlefield. It is set amongst warriors. It is specifically for the highest kind of warrior, that is Arjun. And Krishna really is bringing about an understanding of what life itself means, but ultimately what beyond life means. And not in any sense of a heaven, hell, paradise, and so on, but to realize that living and dying are two faces of the same coin. And that Arjun is to act freely in a state of completely liberated, free mysticism, spiritual realization. Being free of the concept of living and dying, seeing the larger reality of existence itself, and through that attaining to an inner bliss, attaining to true dharma, attaining to the ability to act dynamically. So seeing through death and through that being dynamic in life, being dynamic in action, is in essence the message of the Bhagavad Gita. And Zen Buddhism, of course, is the very basis of the Bushido code of the samurai warriors. You see, the whole martial tradition of Japan is centered around the contemplation of a flower. Strangely enough, it is the sakura blossom, the cherry blossom. The very falling of the cherry blossom from the branch unto the ground, the shedding of the flower, and in that brief space, the sakura blossoms falling to the ground, is the whole basis of Bushido philosophy, which deals with living and dying. So the samurai warrior is to be in a state of consciousness where he realizes that all of life is transitory. And realizing that all of life is transitory, passing by at great speed, he attains to a great fearlessness. He stops fearing death. He stops fearing the end of the body, because he knows that even if the body ends, nothing ends. In the first place, the body is not our reality. So why keep on being obsessed and neurotic about preserving the body? So we can see that the essence of Buddhism is distilled through Zen philosophy, and more specifically through the Bushido code of the samurai. You see, the warrior is a very good metaphor when we have to discuss death, because the warrior is always on the point of dying. Life is very unpredictable for the warrior. Any moment he can die, any moment he can kill. And not only he can he die, but he can kill also. So it's understanding death from both aspects, from both sides. One's own death and being responsible for the other's death. And that too is in the Bhagavad Gita. When Arjun is not so much concerned about preserving his own life, he is actually more concerned about making others die. And Krishna tells him, he laughs and he says, who are you to decide who will die, who will live? That is already decided by the greater existence. And through that, Arjun becomes free. He becomes mentally unburdened. He realizes that if he is to merge with the truth of life, with the truth of existence, this whole barrier about thinking of death in this rather small manner which we generally use to think about death is not needed. We need to expand our consciousness about death, and when we do that, all the barriers to our spiritual progress evaporate. They disappear. Now, this is what makes spirituality fundamentally relevant to human civilization. You see, these are eternal these are very ancient teachings. Tantra, of course, so ancient, so much rooted in antiquity that nobody really knows when it arose. The Bhagavad Gita itself is so ancient. And Zen, though relatively modern, the hidden root of Zen is very, very ancient. Yes, of course, it's relatively modern compared to Tantra, compared to the Bhagavad Gita. But its truth is eternal. It does not change with civilizational progress. That is the beauty of these spiritual paths. The paths which really contemplate on death without getting into the rewards of heaven, the tortures of hell, and all that nonsense, all that children's stories, and deal with death as the ultimate facticity of life and how to transcend the fear of it. Those paths always have relevance for man. Will always have relevance not only for man but for this entire universe, because everything lives and dies. Everything goes through a certain cycle and lives and dies. Therefore, these paths are utterly relevant. And they don't accept the foolish notions, the imaginings of religions which keep harping upon what will happen to us after death and so on. All those fictions created by religions which tell us how we'll be punished in a very literal way or we'll be rewarded in a very literal way for very small material activities of ours. Tantra goes beyond that. The Bhagavad Gita goes beyond that. Zen goes beyond that. It does not try to polish and to present a very rosy picture about how religion can salvage one from the very fact of our non-existence. It paints no such picture. It has a very direct approach. It says that everything eventually is in a cycle of coming and going. So nothing is gained, nothing is lost through life, through death. And through this negation of all sorts of empty notions about death, all sorts of fictional notions about death, it liberates us to the extent that we realize living and dying are but two natural parts of the same circle. And really, the sadness, anguish, anxiety, and so on in life is unessential because it keeps us from being more dynamic in the moment. And ultimately, it's all about being dynamic in the moment that really matters. It is the level of passion, it is the level of love, it is the level of aliveness, it is the level of sheer gratitude within the moment, here and now, that truly matters. If you miss that, you have missed your whole life. You could live 1,000 years, but without the moments of gratitude, those 1,000 years are utterly wasted. You see, it's very interesting. In Greek mythology, Achilles is given the choice about whether he could live for an exceedingly long time, or he could die, and he could live for an exceedingly long time but not live a very glorious life. Or he could choose to live a very short life but a glorious one. And he chooses the way of glory. He chooses the way of the hero. And that is what Tantra deals with as far as death goes. It deals with Vira, energy, Viracharya, the ability to be completely courageous in the face of death. You see, Gautam Buddha had a very interesting technique to prepare his followers for the higher paths of meditation. He used to send them to the cremation ground, the Shamshan, and ask them to meditate for several days over there. And what is the meditation? Just seeing people coming, being burnt, being cremated. And through that very act of witnessing firsthand the elimination of the body itself, something used to awaken in that young monk's mind, in that young monk's consciousness. A discontentment for the kind of life that they had been leading so far, which was just filled with ideas about how life is to be lived. Suddenly the monk realizes that ultimately all of life is a preparation only for one thing: how to die well. And he became more and more mature in his meditative attitude. And this whole concept about how to die well is at the heart of Zen culture. You see, the samurai say that ultimately all of life is a preparation for death. The entire strength of the samurai is calculated not so much by his physical prowess as a warrior. No, that's not the point at all. The point is how he can face death. If a samurai of lesser skill can face death heroically, can face death with a consciousness of the deathless, the immortal, the timeless, and so on, that is considered the true power of spirituality within the samurai. And that is what they say the way we should be. No matter what happens, the ability to accept the mystery of the ultimate happening, the ability to be fearless in the face of the most fearful thing, to face up to the facticity of death, face to face, directly. And through that, witnessing of that fact to attain to fearlessness is true prayer in the Zen attitude. There is no other prayer. That is the true prayer of the samurai. You see, before going into battle, the samurai was asked to compose a Zen poem. Not asked to, that was the way of the samurai. So the death poem of the samurai was really a summation of his entire life. And what is the death poem? The death poem was a very remarkable, heartfelt, natural expression of the samurai. Whatever his inclinations, if he was fond of the cherry blossoms, he used to write about the cherry blossoms. If if he wants to write about Mount Fuji, he could write about Mount Fuji. If he wants to write about a river and the fish in it, he could write about that. That is not the point. The subject is not the point. The whole point was dissolving into existence itself, becoming one with all that is, becoming one with the natural cycle of life. Realizing that the blade of grass dies, realizing that the flower dies, realizing that the trees die, realizing that the stars die, realizing that everything is following this natural course. Only man thinks he's ultra special. But the way of Zen is that no, you realize that you are part of the same cycle, the same natural cycle of everything. And in that way, you come to a true oneness of realization with nature, with existence itself. So, why is Zen important? Why is Tantra important? Why is the Bhagavad Gita important when it comes to death? It makes us realize that our ego takes us away from understanding our oneness with all of nature. Why has man become so distant from all of nature? Man thinks he's separate from all of nature. Nature is somewhere else. We are somewhere else. We coexist, but we have something greater in us. But what Zen does is it brings us back to earth. It says, no, just as everything lives and dies, so too we live and die. The only thing that matters is the quality of consciousness that you can bring. At the bodily level, at the physical level, man is not special at all. In fact, other creatures have more strength, they have more beauty. Look at a tiger. Tiger is far more beautiful phenomenon than human being. But yes, within the human being is the capacity for bliss, the capacity for meditativeness, the capacity for love, the capacity for consciousness to be evolved, the capacity to become prayerful through evolution of consciousness. Not through belief systems, but through evolution of consciousness. And you can look at any path in the world. You can look at the way Jesus died. What was he doing? The entire symbolism of esoteric Christianity, not mainstream Christianity also, is death. It's the crucifixion of the Christ. But we seldom understand it that way. We become too obsessed in theology. We become too obsessed with a certain institutionalized way of looking at Jesus of Nazareth. Take away the institutionalized learning and then you understand that Jesus taught us not only how to live well, but how to die well. You see, die without complaints. And that too is the teaching of a Socrates. Socrates, in as much as he taught great philosophers such as Aristotle and Plato, eventually it was the way he died which summed up his entire philosophy in life. He didn't have to say anything even. It was so eloquent. His death was so eloquent. His very manner of dying was so eloquent that all his philosophy, all his wisdom was encapsulated in that. So dying well is literally the most fundamental part of spirituality. Who was it who once said that if you take away death, there would be no religion? You see? So you look at Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. That itself gives you an indication about how important the question of death is in the Tibetan understanding, about how it is really that culminating moment which allows you to take a leap of consciousness. Either you take a leap of consciousness through fearlessness about death, or you allow it to make you fearful, and through that you fall in consciousness. Similarly, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, they're all very psycho-spiritual means of making us dissolve our ego, making us understand that our stream of consciousness, our mind stream, is part of something far larger, part of an energy system far greater than that at the material, physical level. So that's the way of all of Vedanta, for example. You look at the Ashtavakra Gita, you look at the Yoga Vasishtha Maharamayana. They're essentially echoing these ideas about death. Interestingly, in Indian mysticism, if you look at the Naga Babas, you look at the Aghoris, you see the Aghoris, the whole way of the Aghori is, the way of Aghora is to live in the Shamshan, live in the cremation ground. And what is the wisdom of that? The wisdom is that suddenly that which you realize to be a fundamental energy, the energy of mind and body, that realization is to be shattered because you are not ultimately the mind and body. The Aghora says mind and body are just a very, very, very small, superficial part of you. The essential part of you can only be discovered when you become unconventional in your understanding about death. Don't go by what the priests say, don't go by what religion says. The Aghoras reject everything about Vedanta. They reject everything about mainstream Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, everything. They live unconventionally, and they say only when you forget all the rubbish theology about death is when you can come face to face with it. So Aghora is the ultimate Tantra. It says it is the essence of the Tantra path. It says that if you can meet death blissfully, all that you need to attain has been attained. Similarly, this is what the Bauls say. And Rabindranath Tagore, a person who was so influenced by Baul philosophy, has written, composed extensively about death. But the strange thing about his death poetry, his death songs, is that they seem utterly joyful, they seem utterly blissful. In fact, that's a complete aberration. You see, most literature, most music about death is very somber. It's very serious in tone. Rabindranath Tagore is an exception. He makes the idea of death into something blissful. And he says, my God, people pray for pray for mukti, moksha, liberation, nirvana, freedom from the cycle of birth and death. He says, but I only ask for one thing, that you send me back onto this earth again to wonder again at your vast existence, the beauty of all of life. That's all I want after death. I don't want anything else. Send me back here. I don't want any of that nonsense of liberation. I don't want liberation. The world is so beautiful. So Rabindranath's way is a deep appreciation of life. And if you can appreciate the beauty of life to that extent, then you come to the very source of joy. You come to the very source of your fundamental spiritual energy. And then nothing is in darkness. Everything seems lit up with great joy. Everything seems like it is in a complete organic unity. Living and dying are just parts of the same cosmic symphony being played out in the depths of existence. So the way of the divine, the way of the eternal, the way of the timeless is really to listen rightly to what is transpiring now. If you can do that in this very moment, you'd find the presence of a greater energy around you. And through that presence of a greater energy, that consciousness of a greater energy around you, you're able to function with a dynamism and fearlessness that nothing can stop you. And that is the courage that Arjuna is imbued with on the battlefield. Krishna is simply taking away all his fundamental ideas about death. You see, the first thing Arjuna is asking about Krishna is about death itself. How does he kill? Why should he kill others? And this is very controversial. You see, there are several people who say that Krishna should not have encouraged Arjuna to kill the others on the battlefield. It's the beginning of violence. It sets a precedent, so anybody can say, no, we need to kill because it's part of dharma. But Krishna is talking at a different level. He's talking about a psychology that is able to move beyond conventional killing out of hatred, killing out of fear, killing out of a sense of wanting violence. He's talking about a killing, first of all, for a war of justice. But secondly, and more importantly, he's saying that ultimately we are not the decision makers about the entire cosmic cycle. There are higher energies at work which decide the circle of the cosmos. What we need to concentrate on is doing what is our path. And doing that rightly, not fighting out of a state of violence, not fighting out of a state of hatred. He's not telling Arjuna to hate the enemy at all. Not fighting out of a state of mental fear of the other. No, being free of all those illusions, being free of all those negative tendencies that we associate with the act of killing. Taking away all that and transforming one's energy into feeling that one is simply acting as an instrument of the greater. Now, this is a very difficult question. You see, J. Robert Oppenheimer used the same argument to create the nuclear bombs, atomic bombs. He was deeply influenced by the ideas about the Bhagavad Gita and its ideas about death, its ideas about battle, its ideas about finishing the enemy and so on. So, J. Oppenheimer in fact quoted the Bhagavad Gita saying, "I am become death, the destroyer of all worlds," when he watched the atomic explosion for the first time. But later on, he became totally anti-nuclear. He realized that for people of a smaller, lesser consciousness, it is completely unjustified to give them nuclear weapons. It's like arming a monkey with an AK-47. What will the monkey do? The monkey can just shoot at random and people will get hurt. So, when it comes to the idea of death, when it comes to the idea of the warrior, it is basically about evolution of consciousness. Krishna is able to tell Arjun to fight because he knows Arjun's consciousness is of a certain degree. It is not bounded. It is not bounded by feelings of hatred. It is not bounded by feelings of ill will towards his cousins. No. Arjun is a clear-hearted person. Arjun has a clear mind. So, Krishna is talking at that level, to that level of consciousness. And that is the way we are to understand things. It's not that we should condone violence in the world, we should forgive violence in the world, not at all. Killing is wrong, but when it comes to a situation such as that faced by Arjun on the battlefield of life, Krishna says, don't shirk, act dynamically. That is very important for the moment, because the only choice on that battlefield is to hand over victory to Duryodhan, and doing that will lead to a civilizational crisis. And moreover, it will take Arjun away from his self-nature. It will sap him of his strength. So the first layer of our thinking about death, which is the sadness about thinking about death, that needs to be cleared, and that is what Krishna does to Arjun. He takes away Arjun's ideas about sadness about death. He says, don't look at death with a sad face. Don't look at death as something which is your intrinsic, which is an effacing of your intrinsic identity, your personality, yourself. No, first of all, you are not who you think you are. You are a greater consciousness. You are part of the Supreme Brahman, part of the Supreme Reality. What you think your personality is, your identity is, your mind-body is, that is just a very superficial phenomenon. That is not who you really are. So there is absolutely no gain or loss by your killing. And this, in a way, forms the very essence of the Mahabharata itself. You see, the Mahabharata is a very vast text, but if you look at it in essence, it's all about living and dying. Death is as much a theme of the Mahabharata as living is. Similarly in the Ramayana, and this is an aspect about mythology which has often been overlooked. People don't look in the death part of mythology as much as they look at the other storytelling parts about it. But if you look at mythology all over the world, it's always culminating with the question, the larger question of death. You can look at all of Homer's work, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and so on. You can look at mythology from China, from Japan, from any part of the world. Essentially, the hero is confronted with the idea of death itself. So in the Ramayana, really, it is Ravan's dying, which is perhaps the most poignant moment in the entire Ramayana. And at that point, Ram specifically instructs Lakshman to take the teaching of wisdom from Ravan. And Ravan shows his most noble face when death is confronting him, when he's just about to leave this mortal world. He advises on the most profound aspects of leadership and so on. So his consciousness is able to transcend the physical and psychological plane. It's able to move into the psychic plane, the higher plane of thought. Similarly, in the Mahabharata, you can see Bhishma. So Bhishma is on the bed of arrows. He's on the point of death. He's on the point of death, but not dying easily, dying in a very torturous manner. But you see how graceful he is in that whole episode when he instructs Yudhishthir on the art of leadership. And actually, Sri Krishna instructs Yudhishthir to take the lessons from Bhishma, because the art of leadership can best be taught by Bhishma. He is, in a way, the conscience keeper of the entire civilization. And at his moment of death, over many days, he instructs Yudhishthir about how leadership is not to be led by ego, but by wisdom. So the highest teachings flow from Bhishma when he is at the point of death. He could have given the teachings earlier, but they would not have been so poignant. They would not have been so focused. They would not have been so taken seriously. So remember, the great person always moves towards a higher consciousness when the fact of death comes. Most people move into a state of fear, into a state of inwardness when death comes. The fact of death is fearful. Yes, that's natural. But eventually, the highest teachings can only be disseminated through the facticity of death. You look at the Katha Upanishad. It is such an important text in all of Hindu thought, in all of the Sanatan Dharma. The conversation between Nachiketa, the boy, and Yamraj himself, death himself personified, the Lord of Death, Dharamraj. You see, the entire philosophy of the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Vedanta, the Sankhya, it's all been distilled into the Katha Upanishad. It's all about living and dying. It's all about how to face death. It is all about life and death. So eventually the highest texts always deal with this thing about death. But we have to remember, we must go away from childish notions about reward and punishment and judgment day and all that nonsense. It's complete bunkum, because it takes you away from the essential evolution of consciousness. Remember, teachings which are rooted in mere belief systems will never reach to those great heights which teachings about consciousness reach up to. Consciousness teachings are the way of Sanatan Dharma. Consciousness teachings are the way of Tantra. Consciousness teachings are the way of Zen Buddhism. So you'd find mature spirituality, the spirituality of a Kabir, the spirituality of a Nanak, the spirituality of a Zoroaster, the spirituality of a Baba Gorakhnath, fundamentally deal with the question of death. The spirituality of the Tirthankaras. You see, it's very interesting about Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta Maurya became such a powerful king from the age of 16 onwards. So powerful that there was a healthy mutual respect between him and the Greeks. And at the age of barely 41, 42, he renounced the world and he went away to become a Digambar Jain Muni in South India, where he died of starvation. He starved himself of death. So you see, the transformation of Chandragupta happened when he went from living this life of great opulence, great luxury, great power and so on. But when he realized that all this is meaningless when confronted with the ultimate facticity of death. And through that he realized that he must take such action that allows him to confront the ultimate question. And he moved towards it, which is why Chandragupta is non-paral. He is absolutely incomparable in the annals of history. Because here is a monarch, here is a grand, powerful monarch who has given up everything in this utter quest. And remember, Chandragupta does not belong to mythology, he belongs to recorded history. So it's very credible what happened to him. He went with his guru, I think it was Bhadrabahu. It was his Jain Muni guru. And I think he gave up his body in Shravan Belgola or some other place in Karnataka. But that's not the point. The point is more fundamentally how one looks at the whole question of living and dying. Contemplation of death creates an evolution of consciousness. This is a fundamental law of the mystic, a fundamental law of spirituality. You can look at it from any angle, it'll still hold true. So, this contemplation about death is moving away from the robot like automation of the consciousness. Somewhere the consciousness thinks it's around forever. So it keeps functioning from an energy which is half-hearted. But the consciousness which understands that no, I can die at any moment, that leads to this flame of truth. That leads to that search. You see, very interestingly, again, with Gautam Buddha, eventually it was the dying person and the dead person which transformed his consciousness. And essentially, if you look at a student of both Sanatana Dharma and Zen Buddhism in the modern world, Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computer, in the speech at Stanford University, he gave this very poignant exposition about how the idea about death and contemplation about death is the most transformative force in life. You see, Jobs himself was dying of cancer. The way what he told the students is extremely relevant. He says, if you are conscious that you're about to die, then you will do that which is fundamentally to be done. Think that this is your last moment on earth. Think that these are your last days on earth. Then do what you need to do as you want to do in your self-nature, in your swadharma. That itself takes you out of your normal half-hearted mode of functioning and takes you unto a higher consciousness, takes you unto a higher dynamism. That is the very essence, the very marrow, the very pith, the very meaning of spiritual life. Not only of spiritual life, but it catalyzes our material life. It makes us concentrate on that which is essential, that which we need to do, instead of contemplating that which is unessential. You see, man's energy is running around in so many directions. Hatred, jealousy, foolishness, lust, passion, etc. I mean, all these distractions in our life. Fundamentally, if you contemplate and meditate upon death, and meditation doesn't mean sitting down, but if you contemplate upon death, as Tantra says you should contemplate death, as Zen says you should contemplate death, as the Bhagavad Gita says you should think about death, is when you make that quantum jump of consciousness and you realize that you can be absolutely fed up of the normal life you lead. It is time now to be blissful, to be joyful, to be creative. There may not be time tomorrow. Live with a full-heartedness. Then ego disappears, then fear disappears, and a radical revolution also takes place within one's consciousness. One moves on to fearless living. One is completely finished with the ideas of ego and so on. All one's activities attain to a brightness, a more luminous state of being. You see, it's like the flame of the candle. They say the candle burns brightest before it's extinguished. So in a similar way, we can look at the death of Vivekananda. Vivekananda, such a great monk, such a great world personality, a personality whose imprint on humanity has perhaps not been gauged at all to the extent that it would be in the future. Is that profound? He knew several years before his death that he'd die before the age of 40. And the way he died was very poignant. You see, he fed his monks, he relaxed himself unto a state of complete retirement, a state where he'd kind of detached himself from that cyclone of activity which he was kept indulging in as a teacher and so on. And they say when he died, all the indications were, according to the scriptures, that his life energy had exited from the highest chakras. So he prepared himself for death. And very interestingly, he fed his fellow monks and so on, something he used to hardly ever do. He prepared himself for it. Similarly, Jesus' Last Supper, you see, he fed his disciples. So it is all a movement towards death. Similarly, when Gautam Buddha was dying, Ananda, his chief disciple, his caretaker, was weeping. And Gautam Buddha told him very interesting. Gautam Buddha said, "You see, Ananda, why you've not been able to attain to enlightenment while I have been alive? Because you've been too obsessed with me as a living being. You've been taking such good care of me that you've been obsessed with me as a living being. You've not realized my higher consciousness as much as you have loved my physical being that you have been taking care of." And he said, once I die is when the true consciousness of Buddhahood will descend onto you. Because then you'll be able to see that even beyond my physical body, there is the state of Buddhahood. And that is what happened. When Gautam Buddha died in his physical form is when Ananda attained to enlightenment. In other words, when you die to the idea of mind and body is when you attain to the idea of the greater, is when you expand to the idea of the vast. And that is essentially the secret of great and fearless living.